Few cities in the world can claim to have as long and important a place in history as London. The city has long had a role in world affairs, be they economic, political, cultural, militarily, or legal, and continues to be one of the most influential capitals in the world. While sporadic settlements going back to prehistory have been discovered along the River Thames, the beginnings of the modern city can be traced back to the Roman invasion in 47 AD, who eventually named the settlement Londinium. Given such a long history, it is understandable that those who believe or study the paranormal can find a wealth of cases from within the sprawling metropolis and urban extremities. Here we look at just a few of the notable cases of the ghosts of London. Early ghost stories. Reports of ghost sightings go back as long as humans have had spoken word, and examples of what would be considered sightings can be found across all forms of ancient text. Often these were seen as omens or even angels, depending on the religious denomination of the witness. But spirits were not confined to human appearance, and indeed there seemed to be just as many animal ghosts haunting the living as there did human ones. In the 17th century, the legend of phantom black dogs became widespread in the countryside, but were not limited to the rural communities. Reports from the late 16th and early 17th century tells of a black dog that terrorized inmates at Highgate Prison, adjacent to the Old Bailey Court in central London, the highest court in England. The story goes that in 1596, a scholar was accused of being a warlock or male witch who was guilty of using his magic to curse the people of London who were experiencing a food shortage. The inmates of Highgate Prison suffered especially since little food made it to them, leading many to turn to cannibalism, feeding on the weaker inmates who could not defend themselves, and this included the unfortunate scholar. According to the story, over the coming days, those who had participated in the grisly murder and feasted on the scholar's flesh found themselves being stalked by a spectral black dog, which they took to be the scholar's spirit, taking revenge upon his killers. It is unlikely the story is wholly true and may have been confused with other events or exaggerated by prisoners retelling the story after their release. It has also been suspected that the legend is inspired by or actually related to a mysterious haunting reported for many years later in nearby Amen Court, where a shapeless black form has been reported creeping along a high wall, but it was believed enough by the population to fear the ghostly creature should they find themselves incarcerated at the prison. One of the more bizarre stories of hauntings in London comes from 1626. In April of that year, London experienced a particularly cold season, and during a coach ride in Highgate, Sir Francis Bacon was discussing alternative methods of food preservation with a friend when the cold environment inspired him to consider keeping meat at lower temperatures to stop it from going bad. His friend scoffed at the idea, but believing there was something in it, Bacon traveled to a nearby farm where he purchased a chicken. He then slaughtered the bird, plucked it, and packed it in a bag of snow, thus effectively producing the world's first frozen chicken. Sadly, for Bacon, he would not live to see the results of his experiment, for on April 9th, he passed away from pneumonia after spending many hours in the freezing cold. At this point, you may be expecting to hear tales of Sir Francis's ghost, probably trying to continue his experiment. However, this case actually concerns the ghost of the chicken. In the period afterwards, people walking through the area began spotting a semi-plucked chicken running around a pond near where Sir Francis had thought of the idea to freeze the creature. When bemused bystanders attempted to approach the chicken, it would then disappear into thin air, and this was not a phenomenon limited to the time. Sightings of the spectral fowl have persisted through the centuries, with one being made as recently as 1970. Another curious animal haunting from this era includes the tale of a legless ghost cat, which haunted the home of Mr. Edward Pitts of Puddledock. The phantom feline was seen repeatedly in the family home and was said to be abnormally large, Pitts saying it was the size of a mastiff hound, but curiously, its legs were rendered invisible. Sightings of the cat coincided with traditional poltergeist activity, involving items moving around the home and doors opening and closing by themselves. More human sightings in London from this period include a case from 1647, when the friend of one Mr. Mohun reported seeing him enter her home through a door she was certain was locked and then leave again without saying a word. Perplexed, she later discovered that Mr. Mohun had in fact been killed that day, having been attacked on his way to a duel. Another reported haunting occurred at the historic meat market at Smithfields, which seemingly suffered a spate of ghost sightings in the early 1600s, involving a specter who would appear to dance over the produce. Victorian Era. From 1837 through the remainder of the century, Great Britain was ruled by Queen Victoria, who lends her name to this period. During her reign, London would see great changes technologically, geographically, socially, politically, scientifically, and it would seem spiritually. The Victorian era was arguably the golden age of spiritualism and seances, and tarot readings were all the rage amongst London's high society, and with money to be made, this inevitable led to the emergence of a number of charlatans, as well as fake mediums who claimed to be able to communicate with dead relatives, but who had actually simply researched their patron's family history. A crime punishable with imprisonment if discovered. Victorian London was plagued by hoaxers. Ghost hoaxing was a popular pastime, particularly amongst the youth of the day, if only for the sole purpose of creating mischief, while others even used it to commit robbery or even sexual assaults. These pranksters would often dress up in sheets or cover themselves in bright garments and paint, and leap upon unsuspecting members of the public who might be out, enjoying an otherwise pleasant walk in the park. Some of the more creative pranksters incorporated candles or gaslights to improve their spectral appearance. These ghost hoaxers are often accused of being responsible for one of the more mysterious cases in the Victorian period, namely that of Spring-Heeled Jack. Between 1837 and 1904, stories of encounters with Spring-Heeled Jack terrorized the working-class suburban areas of London and later several other British cities, described by witnesses as being frightful in appearance, with clawed hands and eyes that resembled red balls of fire. He was often draped in a black cloak and was sometimes seen wearing a helmet of sorts. However, his two most distinguishing features were said to be his ability to leap to great height, hence his popular name of Spring-Heeled Jack, and he was often able to breathe blue flames. Spring-Heeled Jack spread fear amongst the local population, which the authorities seemingly unable to do anything about him. Searches were organized but produced nothing, and when he was reportedly cornered by police, he would often escape by leaping over high walls, which stopped their pursuers dead in their tracks. On at least one occasion, Spring-Heeled Jack was shot several times by a pursuer, but each of the bullets simply bounced off Jack's body. Spring-Heeled Jack was soon elevated to the status of a celebrity, thanks to sensationalist reports in newspapers covering sightings of him, and many theories began flying around as to who or what he was. One of the most prominent theories was that Jack was in fact a member of the aristocracy who took pleasure in accosting young women, since these were his main game. On more than one occasion, he was reported speaking fine English to lure an unsuspecting victim out of their homes, such as in the case of Jane Alsop, who experienced Jack in 1838 when he called to her home claiming to be a police officer, so she would open the door. If Jack was the creation of a rich aristocrat, however, then how can we explain his extraordinary traits of being able to breathe blue flame, brush off bullets as though they were nothing, and seemingly defy gravity with his extraordinary leaping ability? Also, given the extraordinarily long period of time sightings of Jack were reported, there surely must have been more than one prankster responsible, since the person first witnessed in 1837 would be at least in their 80s by the time the sightings ended. Some of Jack's sightings can be attributed to public hysteria and imagination, but even if this was the case, it only serves to show just how powerful the belief in the supernatural was throughout the Victorian era. For to most of his witnesses, he was no mortal being, but a ghost or demon of some kind. In fact, while scientific knowledge increased our understanding of the physical world, there was actual resistance to such discoveries when they threatened to debunk the possibility of the paranormal existing. Scientists tried to attribute environmental, medical, and of course criminal factors to explain the ghost phenomenon, believing that no experience could not be explained away somehow with a rational cause. Eventually, the Society for Psychical Research was formed in 1882, which remains the oldest organization with the purpose of investigating psychic and paranormal phenomena. But while British society embraced the march towards scientific advancement in almost every aspect of life, it remained resistant to allowing it to diminish the belief in the paranormal for many people. This led to two camps forming, one which embraced the paranormal, and the other which sought to debunk it scientifically, a debate that continues to this very day. Ghost sightings continued to run rampant in some cases, but unlike in the past, few of them were now simply accepted as being true without rational explanations being affixed to them, leaving many, even witnesses themselves, not sure what to believe anymore. One of the most celebrated and controversial ghost stories of the Victorian era, and one that typifies the debate, comes from an event that occurred on the night of June 22nd, 1893. That night, Lady Tryon was entertaining several guests, all of whom were from the upper echelons of London society. During the evening, several guests were shocked by the surprise visit of Lady Tryon's husband, Sir George Tryon, who was at that time a serving admiral in the Royal Navy and was supposed to be aboard his ship. After being asked by her guests why her husband had returned home, Lady Tryon was as surprised as they were and proceeded to search the house for him, but he was nowhere to be found. Dismissing the whole thing as a case of mistaken identity on the part of her guests, she continued hosting the party until her guests left, before retiring to bed. The next morning, she awoke to heartbreaking news. Her husband's ship had been sunk in a tragic accident off the coast Tripoli the night before, almost exactly the same time as when he was sighted by some of her guests. Had the admiral's ghost returned home to wish his wife goodbye? The story has been retold many times, and some investigators claim that it is either fabricated or there simply was a case of mistaken identity that took place at the party. But if this was the case, it does seem a big coincidence that this happened at the exact time the Admiral's ship was sinking. It's difficult to talk about Victorian London without mentioning Jack the Ripper. This legendary serial killer, or killers if some theories are to be believed, accounted for 5 confirmed murders of women between August 31st and November 9th, 1888, but it has long been suspected there were more. Regardless, some of his victims are said to haunt the city where they were slain, with the Ripper's second victim, Annie Chapman, reported to haunt the site of the former Truman Brewery in Hanbury Street. His third victim, Catherine Eddowes, is said to repeatedly relive the night she was murdered on Mitre Street, while his final confirmed victim, Mary Kelly, is said to haunt the 10 Bells pub, where she frequented, including on the night she was murdered. However, of all the reported cases of ghosts and hauntings to emerge from this period of London's history, none are more terrifying than the nameless horror of 50 Berkeley Square. It is a story that perhaps surpasses even the tales of Spring-Heeled Jack and involved numerous witnesses from across London society, and is one of the few hauntings that resulted in the death of someone present not once, but 3 times. The house itself was constructed in the late 18th century and was intended for the middle to upper classes to reside in the wealthy Mayfair area. Almost immediately, the property seemed to develop an aura of unpleasantness, as though even on a clear day, it would be the one place to have a cloud looming over it. Neighbors enjoyed winding away the evening with guests, telling various stories of questionable authenticity about the property, including that of a woman who committed suicide there to escape an abusive uncle, and the attic being home to a mad relative of one of the numerous owners that seemed to frequently come and go from the property. However it was, when Tory Prime Minister George Canning took up residence there as he came to office, that the house's reputation for being haunted began to spread beyond Berkeley Square. Canning complained to friends and family that the house seemed unsettled, being plagued by strange noises coming from the upper floors. Canning was ill even before moving in, and his time in office was short, as he would die on August 8, 1827, after spending just 119 days as Prime Minister. While his misfortune in office is not directly attributed to the House, his tragic premiership did further the reputation of the House, which spent much of the following decades largely vacant, with few people remaining for any significant length of time. But the stories of paranormal activity persisted. 20-year-old Sir Robert Warboys heard of the alleged haunting and scoffed at the very idea of a curse or ghosts, and was thus dared by friends to spend the night alone on the upper floor, where much of the activity was reported, which Sir Robert accepted. The reluctant landlord at the time would only agree to the proposal on 2 conditions. First, that Sir Robert would take with him a loaded pistol, and secondly, that he would use the bell that summoned the servants if he required any assistance. Later that evening, shortly after midnight, the servants' bell rang gently before, after a pause, the bells started furiously ringing. As the landlord rushed to Sir Robert's room, a shot rang out, and upon entering inside, he discovered the nobleman cowering in a corner, his eyes bulging from their sockets in terror. He was totally unable to speak and died shortly afterwards from the horror of what he had witnessed. The next significant owner was a man named Thomas Myers, who moved in 1859. Reportedly, Myers was infatuated with a woman who rejected his marriage proposal, leading him to live alone in the house where he slowly went mad. Neighbors reported seeing the sad man walking from room to room at night with a solitary candle in his hand until November 1874, when he passed away. However, before his death in 1872, it is said that Tory politician Lord Lyttelton accepted a wager to stay a night in the building's attic. Like Sir Robert, Lyttelton armed himself by bringing a shotgun into the room, and during the night, those downstairs heard him discharge the weapon. He claimed someone or something had entered the room and that he had hit his target. However, once the room was illuminated, there was nothing to be found except his spent gun cartridges. When asked to describe what he saw, he said that it looked like a brown mass of tendrils in the shadows. In the late 1870s, the legend of the cursed property was further reinforced by coverage in newspapers and books, which added newly reported encounters, such as a maid on the upper floor being heard screaming. When the other residents reached her, they each described her face being the picture of abject terror. Beyond reason, she had to be taken to a sanatorium where she died less than a day later. The sensationalizing of the curse amongst locals can probably account for a number of the stories to emerge surrounding the house, but it is more difficult to dismiss the case of two visiting sailors who broke in to the house while it was empty on Christmas Eve, 1887. Looking for shelter, the two men, Edward Blunden and Robert Martin, chose one of the upper rooms to bed down until the morning, but during the night they were awoken by disembodied footsteps. When Blunden moved to investigate their cause, he came across an amorphous, pulsating mass of gray blocking his way, which, according to Martin's story, had leapt to attack his friend. Upon seeing Blunden thrown to the ground with the shapeless being attached to his throat, the terrified Martin ran out of the building looking for help and eventually found a police officer. Unconcerned with any legal repercussions of having broken into the property, he told the police officer what happened, and the two returned to help Blunden. In the reports of what happened next, the exact facts appear to have become lost, with the police officer and Martin either finding Blunden mauled and dismembered in the basement or dead on the street, having seemingly jumped from the window to escape the mysterious assailant. Regardless of which version is true, if any, they all agree that Blunden was found with a face contorted with terror. Stories of paranormal activity continued to surround the property well into the 20th century, although nothing as dramatic as another death has ever been reported. The building became a bookstore in the 1930s, and the ghost stories petered out almost completely, but nevertheless the reputation remains. Many investigators have put their own theories forward as to what might explain the strange case of 50 Berkeley Square, ranging from stories being exaggerated deliberately or unintentionally up to a demon or even the devil himself residing there. But of course, it's hard to prove any of them. The most popular theory is that the building developed such a reputation that those like Sir Robert and Lyttelton who dared challenge it lost their nerve and their minds played tricks on them. In a sense, their encounters becoming a self-fulfilled prophecy that something did exist there, and it was hostile. Regardless of whatever the truth may be, the building still attracts tourists interested in its chilling story, which has earned itself a firm place in the paranormal history of London. the Tower of London and Buckingham Palace. When discussing London's paranormal history, two locations will inevitably come up, namely the Tower of London and Buckingham Palace. The earliest parts of the Tower of London were laid by William the Conqueror after his Norman army successfully invaded England in 1066, and over the following centuries, new areas were added, expanding the site to its present size and appearance. While the tower has served various purposes over the centuries for each monarch who held the crown of England, ranging from the mundane to the ceremonial, it is its use as a prison that has gained it the most notoriety, and this is not restricted to ancient history, with 12 people imprisoned and executed there on charges of espionage and treason during the two world wars. After the war, it served as a prison for perhaps two of the most well-known criminals of modern British history, namely Ronnie and Reggie Kray, the notorious Kray twins, who were among the last prisoners kept there. Today, the tower is one of the most visited attractions in London, with nearly 3 million visitors looking to explore the historic site every year. But if stories are to be believed, the history surrounding the tower may not be as far away as one might perceive. A number of ghosts with royal links are said to haunt the Tower of London, but easily the most famous and widely reported is the spirit of Anne Boleyn. Few need to be told the story of Anne Boleyn again, but in a nutshell, she became the second wife of Tudor King Henry VIII, after he divorced his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. The divorce severed England from the influence of the Catholic Church, but while the story is often retold emphasizing the love and passion Anne and Henry shared for one another, its ending would forever solidify the story in the conscious minds of the world ever since. Accused of treason against Henry, adultery, and even of incest with her brother, charges that have long been suspected of being fabricated by a frustrated Henry because she had not bore him a male heir, she was beheaded at the Tower on May 19, 1536. Since that fateful day, Anne Boleyn's ghost has been seen in numerous places around the Tower, most notably in the Queen's house, where she is said to have stayed the night before her coronation as queen. Another common location for sighting her sad spirit at the Tower is at the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she was buried under the floor the day she was executed. In the late 19th century, a captain of the guard noticed a light coming from inside the locked chapel late one night, and after placing a ladder against the wall, he climbed up to peer into the chapel windows to investigate. According to the story, the captain witnessed a procession of knights and ladies, dressed in historic costumes, slowly walk down the aisle and led by an elegant female whose face was averted from him. But it did not matter, for he knew who she was. He had seen her portrait many times, and so he was of no doubt that the woman at the front of this ghostly procession was none other than Anne Boleyn. What makes the sighting all the more fascinating is that it came shortly after Anne Boleyn's remains were exhumed from under the chapel on the orders of Queen Victoria in order for her to be given a more decent burial. Another well-known tale of Anne's ghost comes from 1864, when a sentry claimed to have seen her specter hovering over the ground, dressed all in white. He reportedly challenged her to identify herself, and when she appeared to be moving towards him without responding, he charged at her with a bayonet. After the weapon went straight through her form, he realized he was dealing with an apparition, and after which struck him with a blue, fiery flash that knocked him unconscious. Recounting the experience, he later identified the spirit as that of Anne Boleyn. This event almost repeated itself in 1933, when another sentry had a remarkably similar encounter, which saw him abandon his post in terror. While startling encounters, they are not as tragic as that of another sentry over a century earlier in 1817. The unfortunate man suffered a heart attack after seeing her on a stairway and lived long enough to tell others what happened before he died. But Anne Boleyn is by no means the only spirit to haunt the tower. An equally tragic tale surrounding the castle is that of the princes in the tower and concerns 12-year-old Edward V and his 9-year-old brother Richard of Shrewsbury, who were locked in the tower by Richard III. The two brothers then mysteriously disappeared, and it has been widely speculated that Richard III had them murdered. Since then, their ghosts have been seen in various rooms in the Tower of London, often holding hands, as though the two of them were looking for comfort from one another. In recent years, there have been several images to emerge claiming to have captured the boys' ghosts. In 2015, medium Christine Hamlet released a photograph she took which claims to depict the boys' ghosts walking beside one another with heads bowed solemnly. Another famous ghost said to walk the halls of the tower belongs to Sir Walter Raleigh. Originally imprisoned for 12 years at the tower before being released, after upsetting King James VI, he lost his head on October 29, 1618, and his spirit has been seen regularly around Byward Tower by guards and visitors. One of the lesser-known specters said to haunt the tower is that of a phantom bear, which, like Anne Boleyn's ghost, appeared to take great pleasure in tormenting sentries during the 19th century. The tower is also the site of a curious story, retold by Edmund Swift, keeper of the crown jewels, in 1817. He reported discovering what appeared to be a glass tube full of strange blue liquid that bubbled as he was later having dinner with his family in their lodgings within the jewel tower. Eventually, he hid it with a chair after his wife shrieked in horror, claiming that whatever was inside had tried to grab her, but the chair went straight through the glass and the substance, which then seemed to disappear through a wall. Less than 3.5 miles away from the tower sits the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, the royal family's London residence and the administrative headquarters of the British monarchy. Originally christened Buckingham House, the palace's origins can be traced back to 1703 and the Duke of Buckingham until it was acquired by King George III in 1761 to be used as a private residence for Queen Charlotte. It did not take on its current role until the accession of Queen Victoria to the throne in 1837, and after which it underwent considerable expansion. While not sharing the paranormal fame that is attached to the Tower of London, Buckingham Palace has its fair share of ghosts roaming its grounds, with some researchers claiming there are numerous entities sharing residence with the royal household. Even Prince Charles is said to have expressed his belief that spirits of the royal family's past still reside at the palace, including reported sightings of Queen Victoria robed in her black clothes as she continues to mourn her husband, Albert. However, it is two specific ghosts that have garnered the most attention from staff at the palace. The land upon which the original house was constructed sits on top of the site of a former monastery, and it is said that the ghost of a monk who died in his cell now haunts the palace's rear terrace, as well as sightings of the ghostly monk. There have also been numerous reports of an invisible chain rattling as well as moaning on the terrace at night. Perhaps the saddest tale of haunting at Buckingham Palace comes from the death of Major John Gwynne in 1910. During the reign of King Edward VII between 1901 to 1910, Gwynne served as the king's private secretary. However, he caused quite an upset when he divorced his wife, something that was seriously frowned upon at the time, causing Gwynne to become depressed as he was ostracized by his peers until finally he could take no more and shot himself in the head in the first-floor office of the palace. Since then, staffers have reported a strange aura in the room, and supposedly a single gunshot has sometimes been heard coming from there, as though Gwynne had been doomed to repeat his death over and over. Modern era, 20th century. Reflecting Britain itself, London underwent a great deal of change in the 20th century. Some of it was spurred on by the natural evolution of a growing city, while some of it was the result of destruction wrought upon the metropolis by 2 world wars. In the 20th century, London also underwent a major cultural change. The city, once seen as being the place of dark, soot-filled streets in the working-class areas and stuffy, suited men in the upper-class areas, became the scene of vibrant colors and music as the swinging 60s dawned and the youth displaced the older generations as the main focus of city life. The city also saw a growing immigrant population coming from the British Commonwealth looking for work and bringing with them their own culture, making London one of the most diverse, multicultural and international capitals in the world. And yet, the ghosts of the past, some figuratively and some may say literally, continued to haunt the capital. Given the huge loss of life suffered by heavy bombing during the Second World War especially, spiritualism saw a resurgence in the first half of the century as grieving men and women tried to make contact with lost loved ones. However, some of those who were lost appear to haven't truly left at all. Biggin Hill was an airfield heavily engaged in defending the city from the Luftwaffe during the Blitz and is now home to a museum commemorating those brave individuals. However, residents in the nearby village often tell of a phantom Spitfire fighter from that dark chapter of history still attempting to make its way back to the airfield. Sometimes the aircraft is silent despite its propeller, turning, implying its engine is switched on, while other times there is only the sound of the engine as the aircraft remains invisible at least to the living. Additionally, the residents have also told stories of cars being flagged down by a small group of airmen wearing World War II-era uniforms, asking for directions to the airfield, only to vanish soon after. One of the more tragic ghost stories to emerge in this era concerns the Greenwich Foot Tunnel, a 370-meter-long tunnel connecting Greenwich to the Isle of Dogs in the Thames River. Many who have braved walking the tunnel at night have reported seeing the ghostly apparitions of a couple dressed in Victorian era and holding hands as they stroll along the tunnel before disappearing into thin air. Investigators have never been able to come up with identities for the couple, which leads to presumptions that they may have died together either by accident, violence, or suicide, but regardless of which they are together now. A curious case involving the damaged house at number 16 Montpellier Road in Ealing towards the end of World War II would have a profound impact on the young boy who had his first paranormal experience there. The young boy named Andrew Green was passing the damaged house with his father when he decided to go exploring inside, and in particular up the short tower that protruded from the top of the building. Green claimed that as he ascended up a ladder to the tower's zenith, he felt something gripping and helping him climb. As he looked out over the roofs of West London, he claims to have heard a voice in his head telling him to walk over the parapet into the garden. The voice said to him, "It's only 12 inches down to the lawn, you won't hurt yourself." But just as he was ready to jump, his father grabbed hold of him to stop him. Green also claims that there were a number of unusual symbols carved into the wall at the top of the tower. Andrew Green was so affected by the experience, he would become a prolific paranormal investigator in later life, earning the nickname of the Spectre Inspector. Returning to the origin of his interest in the field, he began an investigation into the house and found that it was the scene of a horrifying 20 suicides over a 60-year period, and had his father not been there to stop him, it's possible he could have been the 21st. Not so lucky was a 12-year-old girl who leapt from the tower in 1887. Throughout the time it was occupied, the house was reportedly a hotbed of paranormal activity. Between the suicides and even after it was abandoned, workers who attempted to repair the property for sale found themselves unable to stay in the building for more than a few hours. Investigators who visited the property have captured several images of specters on camera, including one supposedly of the little girl. The house has since been demolished, and a block of flats called Eglin Court now sit in its place. But even so, residents of the flats have reported strange goings-on. Another chilling case can be found at the Rising Sun Public House in Cloth Fair. In the late 1980s, two barmaids who were living upstairs at the pub reported experiencing a ghostly presence that would sit at the end of their beds and then try to remove their sheets. A few years later, the landlady of the pub was taking a shower when she felt an icy cold hand run down her spine. But when she turned around to see who was touching her, there was no one there. Local legend tells of a group of body snatchers who would frequent the pub in the 19th century, when it was commonplace for such criminals to acquire fresh bodies to sell to doctors for experimentation, and it is suspected the spirit of at least one of these snatchers is responsible for the activity. Another public house, the Bowbells, has another spirit that likes to taunt the female patrons, albeit in a less insidious but still unnerving manner. Since the 1970s, the pub has had a spate of reports of women using the restroom only to have unseen hands yank the chain down, causing the toilet to flush. It sounds comical, but it became such a nuisance that in 1974, a séance was held at the pub in an attempt to rid the building of the ghostly culprit. It failed, and the phantom flusher was reported being active up into the 2000s. But perhaps one of the more controversial cases to emerge in this period was that of the so-called Enfield poltergeist. In August 1977, police were called to the home of Peggy Hodgson and her children in the London borough of Enfield. When the police arrived, she claimed that she had witnessed furniture moving and that 2 of her 4 children had heard loud knocking against the walls of the house. One of the police officers who responded later explained that while she was making inquiries into the disturbance, she observed a chair start to wobble and then slide across the floor, seemingly of its own accord. This attracted the interest of journalists who visited the property and observed the phenomena appear to increase, to include disembodied voices, loud, unexplained noises, objects fly across the room of their own accord, chairs overturning, and even Mrs. Hodgson's children levitating across the room. The journalists contacted the Society for Psychical Research, who dispatched inventor Maurice Grosse, and investigator and author Guy Lyon Playfair to investigate. Over a period of 18 months, more than 30 people, including neighbors, the researchers, journalists, and visitors, all reported witnessing the startling phenomena. Eventually, Grosse was able to record the entity speaking through Janet Hodgson, one of the children, who explained that he was a former occupant of the house and who died in a chair downstairs. The whole affair was covered in Playfair's book, This House is Haunted, but from the earliest reports, some skeptics accused the children of being responsible for the activity. They even went so far as to accuse Janet of engaging in ventriloquism to produce the disembodied voice. However, Janet and her siblings have remained adamant that they were not behind any of the activity, and Maurice Grosse defended his belief that the house was haunted for the rest of his life. And with renewed interest in the case 50 years later, thanks to movies and television shows, supporters and skeptics continue to debate just what really did happen in that house for that year and a half. Haunting of the London Underground. Becoming possibly just as iconic a landmark as Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, or Nelson's Column, London's historic underground subway system is one of the most recognizable parts of the modern city. Known colloquially as the Tube, the modern London Underground network can trace its origins back to the London Metropolitan Railway and was the world's first underground passenger transport system. Today, up to 2 million passengers board the electric trains along 250 miles of track serving 270 stations every day. Given the utilitarian nature of the London Underground, it's easy to forget that it has its own fascinating history. As already mentioned, it gave the world the first underground rail passenger network, which is now a common feature in many major cities around the world. It allowed people to move around London far quicker than before when using horse and carts, and opened up much of the city to the wider population. In over a century and a half of operation, 5 babies have been born on the Tube, 2 of which occurred in 2019. But perhaps one of its most famous roles was to provide shelter from air raids for Londoners during the Blitz. However, the Tube is also the scene for many tragedies. On December 19, 1866, a large steel girder over the tracks at Barbican Station, now Aldersgate, fell onto a carriage, killing 68-year-old Sarah Johnson, who became the Tube's first fatality. On February 28, 1975, at 8:46 a.m., a busy commuter train crashed into a wall as it reached the end of the line at Moorgate Station. 43 people were killed and 74 injured, making it the worst peacetime disaster to befall the Underground. The cause of the crash was determined to lay with the driver, who either unintentionally or deliberately failed to stop at the station. However, it was during the Second World War that the London Underground would see its greatest tragedy. On March 3, 1943, as a crowd of people were entering Bethnal Green Station to take shelter from an air raid, an anti-aircraft battery in nearby Victoria Park launched a salvo of anti-aircraft rockets into the air. This caused the crowd to surge forward, believing the bombing was about to start. A woman tripped on the stairs, causing many others to fall over her, and in the chaos that followed, 173 people were crushed to death. Despite these tragedies, the London Underground is still one of the safest and most efficient ways to travel around London today. On average, the tube suffers just one fatality for every 300 million journeys. And even then, the majority of these are suicides, which cannot be attributed to any factors regarding the system itself, but with such tragic stories in its past. It is little wonder that the tube is well known for its hauntings. Staff working at Bethnal Green Station have often reported hearing the sounds of what many believe to be the cries of those crushed to death during the war. Sometimes, the sounds are solitary in nature, such as that of a whimpering child or a crying woman, but other times, staff members have reported hearing a wave of frightened and panicked voices. In one instance, a lone worker at the station reported hearing the commotion for some 15 minutes, prompting him to leave the station in terror. In 1984, a trainee manager was walking the line near South Island Place alone as part of his training when he encountered a solitary worker walking the other way holding a Tilly lamp. The two of them exchanged pleasantries and then continued on their way. However, when he informed staff at the end of his walk, he was told no one should have been in the tunnel. They organized a search for the man before trains began to run along the line again, but he was nowhere to be found. The trainee manager was then told that he was by no means the first person to have encountered the ghostly man. But the hauntings of the London Underground do not appear to be a relatively recent occurrence, nor are they limited to people. In 1928, an entire spectral train was reported passing through Kensington Station at the end of the working day. According to the report, a phantom worker wearing a reefer coat and flat cap clung to the railings on the ghost train as it disappeared into the tunnel, giving out a faint whistle as it departed. Another ghost train has been sighted running between East Finchley and the Wellington Sightings. One of the more unexpected hauntings linked to the underground concerns that of an Egyptian princess. Between 1900 and 1933, the British Museum had a dedicated station that included artifacts from Egypt. The disturbing of these artifacts are blamed for the princess haunting the station during the time it was operational, with visitors and staff reporting her terrifying screams, which were said to be so loud that they could be heard as far down the tunnel as the next station. Some reports claim that the screams can still be heard coming from the closed station. One of the more famous haunting centers around the murder of one William Terrace on December 16, 1897. Terrace, a professional and well-liked actor, was stabbed to death in the Adelphi Theatre by another actor, Richard Archer Prince, who had become mentally unstable. Since then, Terrace's ghost has been seen at both the Adelphi Theatre and standing on a platform at Covent Garden Station, which is unusual since the station was built after Terrace's untimely death. Equally curious, or at least coincidental, the station adjacent to Covent Garden is Holborn, less than half a mile down the track, and whose opening would render the nearby British Museum station unnecessary. It is at Holborn where the Egyptian princess's screams are reported to still be heard coming from the direction of the abandoned station, and this gives us an idea of just how dense the hauntings of the underground can be in places. Recent sightings. Given the wide array of sightings through history in London, it would be easy to dismiss the reports as something of the past. But this is far from the case. London continues to be a hotbed of paranormal activity, and there seems to be no let-up anytime soon. In the 2000s, Holborn Library saw a spate of activity, including an archivist using a mirror in the third-floor bathroom, glimpsing a person walk behind her. Surprised, she turned around to face the visitor, but was horrified to find that where she had seen the person standing in the mirror, there was nothing but empty space. More dramatically, an art curator on the fourth floor, which at that time was not in use, was violently pushed in the shoulder by an unseen presence. Finally, a cleaner working in the basement was seen running out of the building in terror and refusing to go back in. When staff tried to ask her what she had seen, she was reportedly too terrified to even say it. The Haymarket Theatre Royal is said to be haunted by a ghost who only shows himself if an upcoming performance will be successful. Known as Buckstone, Star Trek actor Patrick Stewart reportedly spotted the ghost during a performance of Waiting for Godot. The ghost of a former manager of the theater, David Morris, is also reported to return every few years to the theater just to cause trouble for a single night. A frightening incident occurred at an apartment in Vanden Court in 2005. The owner of the apartment returned home to discover a man wearing a U.S. Air Force uniform and holding a clipboard waiting for them. The man was said to be a handsome and happy chap and extended their hand, which the owner accepted, but upon contact with it, they felt extreme cold, causing them to scream, which alerted neighbors. By the time they arrived, the U.S. Air Force man had vanished. In 2018, Jane Cunningham was taking photos of her family at the Bethnal Green Museum on her iPhone when she noticed two girls in the background of some of the pictures that she is certain were not there at the time. The two women appear Asian in appearance and are apparently dressed in Oriental clothing. Additionally, in one picture, there appears to be a purple, skull-shaped orb alongside them. Mrs. Cunningham was so intrigued that she conducted research into the history of the building and made a shocking discovery. She found that the building was constructed in the 17th century, and a number of immigrant women were employed to decorate it. She believes that the two women in the picture were one of those who were brought to Britain at that time. The Angel of the Thames. Given that the stories of London's hauntings are largely centered on tales of melancholy, we feel it only right to end on a less bleak story from recent years. Originating in the wake of the Great Fire of London in 1666, many people have reported sighting a white being floating over the Thames River and experiencing feelings of hope and joy upon sighting it. Dubbed the Angel of the Thames, the being has been sighted repeatedly over the centuries since the Great Fire, often being seen as giving help or simply reassurance to those who need it, even if they don't realize they do. In 2006, student Jemima Waterhouse was en route to meet a friend when she spotted a strange, wispy light hovering close to the Thames Queen Mary floating restaurant and immediately felt a sense of comfort and peace. She quickly photographed the apparition with her phone, and viewing it on her computer, she saw the distinct outline of what appeared to be an angel. Like many mysterious events, there are those who believe the angel is paranormal or supernatural in origin, and then there are those who argue that it is some natural phenomenon or a hoax. I guess the fact of the matter is, as has always been the case, people will only see what they believe is the truth.